In this episode, Kevin Chemidlin, my friend and founder of Grow the Show, joins us back to talk about why most podcasts struggle to make money and how to keep it from happening to you, so that ultimately you can experience bigger profits from your show and have stronger relationships with an audience who knows you, who likes you, who trusts you, and who is eager to buy from you. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Kevin, welcome back.
Good to be back. Rock and roll round two.
Yes, let's do it. Well, you know, something else that you say that I think is just, it makes me laugh again every time I hear it, is this idea of the longer you wait to monetize your podcast, the better off you're going to be. And I mean, laugh in a good way, you know, because it's like, okay, this actually has a lot of truth in it, but yet it's not something that's on anybody's minds, on anybody's radars. They're thinking, I need to monetize as quickly as possible. Can you break down the rationale behind this? And why is waiting to monetize such a huge advantage?
Yeah. So the first thing, every podcaster under the sun is asking the question, how can I monetize my podcast? How can I monetize my podcast? To which I say, terrible question. Why? Because the question that I ask is, at what moment is your podcast monetized? And most people say, well, it's when I make money, right? Because again, I test, right? So I just want to get paid to do this. I'm like, okay, stick with me here. If you're making money, who is paying you? And usually they kind of look up and they're like, I never thought of it that way. And they'll be like, oh, my sponsors. And I'm like, okay, well, who is paying them? And they look up again at the sky and they're like, I guess my listeners. And I'm like, yes. Okay. So sponsorship and brand deals is nothing but another company paying you in advance for your listeners to buy their stuff. And their hope is that their listeners are going to buy more stuff. They're going to make more money on your listeners buying their stuff than they paid you. That's how it works. Or if you're a business owner, you can skip the middleman and you can still sell stuff directly to your audience, products, services, whatever it is. But a better question to ask, and a question that I have found helps podcasters make money faster, is not how do I monetize my podcast, but what might my audience want to buy? What can I recommend to my audience that they can buy, that they would want, right? So it's stuff that they would actually want, they're going to buy anyway, where I can get a cut of them buying that thing in some way, shape, or form, either through profit because I sold it to them or through sponsorship money because they bought blah, blah, blah. So usually when I go through that process with a podcaster who has not monetized their show yet, it's either really obvious to them what their audience would buy. And then I'm like, great, guess what? You can monetize your podcast this week if you get one listener to buy something that you get a cut of. But oftentimes the podcaster's like, I really have no idea what my audience would want to buy. And that is a case where I'm like, okay, that means that you either don't know your audience well enough or there's just not enough of them. So in that case, it's, can you continue to make great content and grow your audience and grow the momentum of what you're doing? And usually what I found is that if a podcaster can do this and they can delay monetization, they can delay making the ask, they can delay trying to extract money out of this thing, then what happens is, number one, their audience is bigger when they do finally monetize, so they're able to make more money out of the gate. But number two, your audience usually tells you what they want to buy. They ask you for recommendations. They'll be like, what do you recommend for this? What do you recommend for that? Or they ask you if you would help them. Do you do coaching? Do you have any courses? So that's the golden place to be, to make a podcast and not monetize it as long as possible to where your audience is asking you to essentially monetize them. But I also understand that podcasts are not free to create and that people are spending tons and tons of time, and podcasters would rather get paid for that time. So if you can't do that, right? If you can't wait as long as possible, like if you can't wait forever to monetize your show, then it just becomes simply, how long can you wait? Can you just afford to wait a little bit longer until you have a strategy that makes sense, until you have something where you can monetize your audience? Podcasters, they want to monetize quickly because they feel like it's time. They're just like, I'm tired of not making money with this thing. And so they start to make bad decisions about their show. They start to just be like, how can I make money? How can I make money? And the show gets worse, which makes it harder to grow, which makes it harder to make more money. So that's the reason why I'm like, if you can, put it off as much as you can, because the second you stress over this, your show's going to get worse and it's just going to make everything harder.
Yeah, what I like so much about this, Kevin, is that it also sets expectations for someone getting into podcasting for the first time. And I knew when I started my podcast that the one thing I needed to outsource was editing, because there was no way I'd be able to stay consistent on the publishing side of things, much less the marketing side of things, if I were to have the editing on my plate. And so I had to figure out, and I had a business behind the podcast. So I had to figure out, okay, how can I quote unquote monetize the podcast, right? Or how can I allocate monies elsewhere in the business to get this thing started and then to get it monetized, like we all say, as quickly as possible. But to your point, waiting, there is such a distinct advantage. And I'm curious too, because you mentioned something in there that I want to dig into with you. And this idea of talking to your listeners and having them tell you what it is that they want to buy. And I know in your podcasting journey, you had a podcast that had pretty great success out the gate, and then it hit a plateau and you were like, this thing isn't growing. And you took time off from that podcast and started studying the top podcasts out there to see what were they doing and what were they doing differently. And then started the podcast you have now, Grow the Show. During that time, I remember you said something to the tune of, you sat down with was it 135 people that you sat down and had conversations with? Was that literally a question that you would ask them? Not necessarily like, what would you buy? But like, did that come up in those conversations? Or is there a way that you recommend us putting feelers out there to really find out from our audience, which we know as podcasters can be pretty passive, to find out what is it that they would want most from you, the host?
Yeah. So my original show was about my hometown of Philadelphia. It was not growing. I put it on pause and I took a weekend and I listened to the top 100 podcasts to figure out what they were doing to grow and monetize. I then took what I learned, brought Philly Who back and did the Philly show for another year. And the show grew past 100,000 downloads and about $120,000 monetized over the course of the year. The following year is when I started Grow the Show and started helping other podcasters. And in that case, I was about to launch a course about what I thought every podcaster needed, which was help being a great interviewer. Right. I was like, this is what every podcast needs. Because back then I was like, these podcasts just need to be better. I understand all that way better than I do then. But I was speaking to a mentor who said, okay, maybe that's what these people need. But do me a favor and have a conversation with 12 podcasters and see what it is that they want. And so I, like an overachiever, I was like, I'm going to do 30. So I set up 30 one-on-one calls with podcasters. And he told me, don't ask them if they would buy a course about being a better interviewer. Ask them what they need help with. And that is the distinction that not only helped me pivot and launch something that people actually wanted, but it's now what helps me understand what my audience might want to buy. And it is not asking them what they want to buy, but asking them what their problems, hopes, fears, and dreams are. What is their situation, right? So with these podcasters, 30 conversations, not one of them said, you know what I really need? I just need to be a better interviewer. In fact, they were all like, well, I know the content's not the problem, right? I just need to know how to grow and how to monetize. Every single one, all 30 of them. How do I grow? How do I monetize? How do I grow? How do I monetize? So after the 30th one, I was like, okay, let me create something that helps people grow and monetize their podcast. And that is how Grow the Show is born. But since then, with the 400 plus folks that I've worked with one-on-one, every single time they ask this question of what can I sell them, you just have a conversation with these folks and you ask them about their life situation that is related to your podcast. So you're not asking them about your podcast. You're not asking them what they want to buy. You're just asking them like, what do you struggle with? What do you really want? What do you wish was easier? What products do you already use? What product would it be great if it existed? And while you're doing that, you're listening for things that they might want recommendations on, maybe things that you know about that they don't know about that you could recommend to them, or sometimes things that you can make and sell to them. But the key is just asking them about their situation and their pain points and what it is that they want to change about their life. And then from there, is there something that I could sell them or recommend to them that would help them with that thing?
Yeah. And I would say for those listening that already have an offer, maybe that offer is not converting the way you want. Maybe it is converting, but you can still have these conversations and still keep your ear to the ground and listen for these things because it can help you do what you do better. And Kevin, in your framework, you have a 4-part framework, which is beautiful. It's a ladder really for podcast growth and monetization. And you have monetization as step 4. And I know there's got to be a strategic reason why that comes last. I'm curious, what do podcasters risk if they try to jump ahead to monetization before they're ready or before they should?
Well, most of the time, like the ladder works backwards, right? So you got to have step 1 before you can get step 2. You got to have 2 before 3 and 3 before 4. And my point here is step 3 in the ladder is growth, is the skill of learning how to get new people to discover that your podcast exists. And steps 1 and 2 are the 2 things that make it so that you can grow. Step 1 is having a clear premise. What is your show actually about? Step 2 is what we talked about next, which is how to keep listeners listening. If you can't keep listeners listening, you can't grow your show. If you can't grow your show, you're not going to be able to monetize regularly. And what I mean by that is if your show doesn't grow, let's say your audience is stuck at 100 people and it does not grow, you can get those 100 people to buy something. But what happens after that, right? Like after they've all bought the thing, now what are you going to do? So the reason why I say don't worry about monetization until you understand how to grow your audience is because all of the time and energy that you spend trying to figure out what to sell these 100 people, if instead you took that time and energy and put it into how do I turn this 100 people into 1,000 people, 1,000 new people every single month, then when you do monetize, not only are you going to have a larger sample size of people who might want to buy the stuff that you're selling, but you're going to know how to have new people every single month that can keep buying those things. I see creators all the time who don't know how to grow their audience, but they do know how to make offers to their audience. And the trap that they get into is they just keep making new offers to offer to the same 100 people over and over again. And everybody gets burnt out when that's the problem. So that's why I say monetization is last. We first want to build this thing up to something that can grow and get new people discovering it each and every month. And then from there, you can get new sales and new monetization and new revenue each and every month.
That's a really important distinction. Really important. Also, too, this brings up the question of, okay, so we want to make conversions from our podcast. We want our listeners to buy. How do we track that ROI? This can be a very gray area for a lot of people. It's like, well, someone sat down on a sales call and they mentioned they listened to my podcast. I guess, does that count? Are we like keeping tallies on a whiteboard in our office somewhere? How do you recommend that podcasters track whether their show is actually converting those listeners to leads, clients, and revenue?
Yeah. So I'm curious what you would say to this, because I know this probably touches what you do in the day to day. But for me, it's two places. You mentioned one of them, which is ask people. And it's how many people mention the podcast on my sales calls. And I can measure the difference in months when my podcast is really doing well or it's growing, or like the episodes that I put out were just really great, versus months where I might have phoned it in or just republished a bunch of old stuff or didn't really focus on growing the audience at all. And like people don't mention the podcast as much. There's fewer sales calls. They're harder, and fewer people are like, I can't believe it's so cool to get to talk to you. Right. So that's the more like anecdotal, qualitative way. The quantitative way for me is actually UTM tracking from opt-ins from my podcast. And what the heck does that mean? Well, essentially, my goal with my podcast is to get people not to buy straight from the podcast, but I actually want to get them onto my email list. So if you listen to Grow the Show, you're going to hear more calls to action for freebies, like a free email course or a free masterclass, than you will hear me talk about my program or my services or my courses or whatever it is. And that's because what I have found is not only do people buy more from email as compared to podcast listenership, which if you think about it, it makes sense. People are out for a run while they're listening to your podcast. What do you think they're going to pull over and hop on a sales call, right? It doesn't happen that way. But if I offer them something that they want right then and there, they will put in their email in exchange for that thing. And then I can, send emails that are valuable and then get them to book a sales call. So for me, I measure, and for my clients, we measure the success of the podcast as it relates to ROI from number one, qualitatively, how many people mention the podcast through the sales process? And number two, how many new leads am I getting every single day, every single episode, tracked by how many people actually got there from the podcast episode?
This is so good. This is why part of this question was selfish, Kevin, quite honestly, because it's like, this is what I've been trying to figure out too, is, well, how can we track this better? Because the qualitative part is clunky, but I will tell you, 9 out of 10 people who get on a sales call with us who have heard the podcast, they're like, I binge your podcast. And that's why I'm here, and they already know you. That it definitely helps to shorten the sales cycle in that regard because the trust is already there. On the flip side of that, though, and actually tracking like those click-throughs, I think you bring up such an important point about the fact that, and this is for all the business owners who are listening to this right now, who do have a product or a service that they offer. I think it also helps to have clarity around, when do you count someone as a lead? Is it when they join your email list? Is it when they book a call? Is it when they fill out your application? And then tracking that and optimizing for that on the podcast. For us, it's similar to you, where it's like, if they get on our email list, they're in our world. And we've got those marketing sequences on the back end set up intentionally to nurture them over time. And then giving them, offers, soft offers along the way of, come join me for the workshop, or come, hey, book a call if you're ready for that. And so I think that's a really smart way to think about approaching it on your podcast. Because to your point, a lot of people, they're on the treadmill, they're not going to go like hop over the sales page and like read, an endless scroll sales page. page, be like, yes, I want to spend $4,000 on your thing and buy your thing right now. Maybe some people would. That'd be great in a perfect world. But this is really helpful to hear you say that, it is a bit of a mix, because it's not as simple as saying I have this landing page set up and therefore everyone that comes through this landing page, is definitely from a Facebook ad or whatever it might be. And so this helps us to think about, as podcast hosts and even aspiring podcast hosts, okay, if the podcast is to serve your business and it's supposed to be a marketing tool within your business, to reverse engineer that process, ultimately, where are we leading someone? And how does a podcast support that? I've got one other question for you, though, and I want to pivot here a little bit, because I've heard you say that marketing and monetizing a podcast, so growth, monetization, both of these are skills that you can learn. And I think that right there is just gold, because a lot of people come into this expecting to have it all figured out, whereas most of us have been doing this for years and years and years, and we still would admit we don't have it all figured out. We're still learning. The industry is still changing. It's rapidly evolving. So for podcasters right now who are ready to monetize, or they're struggling to make money, of those skills that they need to monetize a podcast, what is one that they should focus on? And what's a first step that they can take today to move closer to actual revenue from their show?
Well, the question is whether or not they have an offer already. So whether or not they already have something to sell. I think regardless, I have yet to see a podcaster who betters their skill of getting new people to find out that their show exists and makes less money. I haven't seen that happen yet. So I think the number one skill is just getting comfortable with new people finding out about your show. The one skill, because the thing is, like, without that, like we said before, monetization, it's going to be a one-trick pony unless you learn how to get new people to discover that you exist, to generate new leads, quote unquote. But if you're not good at monetization, if you don't have a good skill of creating a great product or getting the right sponsors or whatever, if you can get new people to discover you every single month, then every month you get a redo, right? Until you finally get it to work. So it's one where I think a lot of people tend to think that audience growth, social media growth, whatever, is this like je ne sais quoi, like they either have it or they don't. It isn't. That's not what it is. It is simply a skill, and there's several different avenues, different versions of that skill you can learn. We've mentioned so many of them. We mentioned SEO, podcast guesting, YouTube, social media, outbound. There's so many different shapes that you can take to the skill. They all work, and they all will work for your show. So if you've tried one and you're like, that doesn't work, that just means you haven't developed the skill yet to get it to work. They all could work. And so it's a matter of picking one, committing to getting it to work. And then from there, again, monetization is always going to be easier if you can consistently grow.
Yeah. And tell me if you would agree with this too. I feel like also putting calls to actions in your episodes. This is a step I need to get better at doing. We got to talk about our stuff, and if you're a podcaster who doesn't have a business, okay, then find something that your listeners want to buy, and you're still going to have to put those calls to actions in your episode. I don't know why this is a step that I think most of us, we don't want to come across as salesy. We want to lead with value. We want to build that trust. And yes, the podcast is naturally going to do that. But I know, Kevin, this is something that I just can sometimes conveniently forget to do. And I wonder how much of that is really my unconscious mind being like, oh, I don't want to sell to people,
totally.
But at the end of the day, how else are we going to monetize? We got to let people know what we do and how we can help. And so I would say second to that, like you said, pick a skill and then start putting calls to actions in your episodes. Talk about your stuff.
Tell people about your things.
Go back and listen to the episode before this one where Kevin outlined exactly how to do that and help hook people in. Just like we hook them into our episodes, hook them into your world.
Yeah. The one thing I'll say to that is when you learn the skill of making calls to action in a way that works, people like it. So it's not something that they're mad at you about, right? You don't sound salesy. It's like you're offering them something and they like it. And if they go away, people ask for them to come back. And that there's tons of examples of that happening in the past. So that's the one thing about that particular skill, is that it's not a bad thing to ask people to make an offer and tell them what they can do next if they want more.
100%. Kevin, thank you so much for all the wisdom that you shared with us today. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate the work that you do in the podcasting space. Last question for you. How do you want to be remembered as a podcast host, as someone who is shaping the way that the podcasting industry unfolds? How do you want people to remember you?
My hope is that people remember that I was useful, helpful, and gave it to you straight. Every once in a while, I'll get a podcast review or somebody just even goes through my sales process and they say no, but they're just like, hey, I just really appreciate that in your content. You tell us like it is. You don't sugarcoat things. You don't, over, hype everything. And that really means the world to me. I'm just trying to share what I learn and just trying to share what I know. And my hope is that it can be helpful to others.
It definitely comes through. Kevin, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Courtney.
And listen, if this episode was helpful for you, I would love it if you would let me know by leaving a review on the show or leaving a comment on Spotify, or at the very least, tapping the 5 stars on Apple or on Spotify and let me know that the show is helpful for you. And then in the next episode, we're going to be talking about whether or not a podcast can be the magic fix for a struggling business. And I'm going to break down what a podcast can and cannot do for your bottom line, because ultimately a podcast is an amplifier, meaning that it's going to highlight the good, but it's also going to magnify the cracks. So if you have ever wondered whether a podcast could save your business, or if you're looking to a podcast to fix your business, or if you really just want to gain a more realistic understanding of the impact that a podcast can have, the next episode is for you. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.